to get us started?
Why not? We can do that. I'm Laura. I graduated in 2009. I was an Arabic and Peace Studies major. So how I got to where I'm sitting today, so I was Arabic, I studied that all the way through. And then part of my story is the fact that when I graduated, I don't know how well any of you remember, but the economy wasn't doing so well. And so what was going on with my class at the time was there was every one of my classes just signing up to just going on to get there. I joked that it was going to get your MA, MS, JD, PhD, and avoiding the workforce, which economically makes a lot of sense. But I decided that really what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out get a little better idea of what my strengths and interests were, because I was at that point almost interested in just about everything. And so I wanted to find out what my strengths were. So I made the decision to not apply to grad school, and I ended up moving home, saving some money, and then moving to DC without a job, which is crazy. I was staying on friends' couches. But I found something, I started pretty quickly. I got a temp job that allowed me to sort of pay rent and get myself set up. And then my first the temp was actually really interesting. It's a good way to get started, because you can end up in doing policy work just because they need the help. I was working with a life insurance lobby, doing things that I probably should not as a temp have been doing, like filing lobbying disclosures. And things of that nature. So that was a good way to earn some money and get my feet wet. And then pretty quickly, I think within 2 or 3 months, I had my first full-time job offer. I was working at the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, which is essentially a mini think tank attached to a university, to Georgetown, where we were doing research on post-secondary education. So about technical institutes, masters, bachelors, all of that, everything past high school. And looking at economic data to identify, what are the trends there? What degrees pay the best? What degrees pay the best relative to what they cost? What are the policy issues there that the government could do to improve people's outcomes? And that was a really, really interesting experience. It taught me a lot. I was sort of in a more administrative role, but then I got to do research, coordination, coordinate with the press, and all of that. And what I learned from that is the power of having really good numbers, and just the power of numbers in general, like the press and the public, they latch onto that, because these are this is real evidence of what's going on. And when you're, I'm sure there's not a lot of real clear information about, what pays. It's sort of like happenstance, but data as to what people have done before. And I saw how people respond to that. And of course, being in DC, you also see, good numbers, bad numbers, et cetera, and how those are used as ammunition in supporting or refuting different policies. And so sort of from there, I decided that I didn't want to just sort of disseminate numbers that other people are producing. I also, or advocating for positions other people are analyzing. I decided I wanted to do more of a hands-on research role. So I spent some time at the Southern Governors Association, where I got to be the research person in the office, putting out information that focused on states in the American South, and a couple of territories too, but that's another story. And so that was a lot of fun, and that was where I was continued to acquire skills with communication, because sort of my experience has been that there's sort of two sides of quantitative policy research. There's producing the information, and then there's also being able to communicate that to people in broad swaths of the population who don't really work with numbers on a regular basis and don't know how to interpret that, trying to find ways to communicate that effectively and to get the point across. And so I got to do both sides of that. But then from there, I wanted to get more of the hard skills of the quantitative analysis. So I spent some time volunteering abroad, which was fantastic. And then I got my master's in public policy at the University of Chicago, where I got to do exactly what I wanted, of learning how to analyze and how to apply the different methods to policy research. And then from there, I got to do some cool stuff while I was in grad school. I did some research, did some traveling. I interned in India for an NGO that does a giant education survey every year. And sort of that set me up for where I am now, where I am a research analyst in Mathematica, working on a range of international development issues. We do primarily impact evaluations, where you develop a scientific method to figure out what's working, where are you seeing an effect of a different program. But we do a lot of other different kinds of things, sort of just to help clients understand what their work is doing in a range of different ways. So that's where I am now.
Katie, you're next in our screen. You want to?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks to the Career Center. It's also really great to be part of an all-women panel. That doesn't often happen, so like, way to go. So I lived in Farley Hall, and I was a political science and peace studies double major while I was at Notre Dame. I wrote a senior thesis on the effectiveness of international interventions on stopping mass atrocities against civilians. And so through that process, I kind of distinguished down which area of peace studies I really wanted to focus in on. And so I saw that I really enjoyed doing the research aspect of it, but also on something that had a lot of real tangible policy relevance for the US and for others who are interested in peace and conflict. And so I graduated kind of narrowly looking at the policy field in these areas, atrocity prevention, peace building, conflict resolution. And there's a lot of competition for jobs in that area. And not to scare you with echoing some of the same stories that Laura just mentioned, but I also did move home to Chicago and took a temp job where I worked for a technology company for about 10 months while I saved up money and applied for jobs out in Washington. I ended up getting an unpaid internship for the summer, moved out to DC, and took the unpaid internship with the Enough Project, which is an organization that does work to end genocide and crimes against humanity, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa. And so with them, I was doing policy and research work as an intern, and it was a really great experience in terms of, one, getting out to DC, first of all, opportunities to go to events and meet new people, opportunities to publish my name with blogs and other things about topics that I really cared about. And then, but while I did that, I also was doing kind of side research for one of my thesis advisor from Notre Dame. So I was doing kind of the nitty gritty, not so fun areas of research where you're reading and coding things, but it paid the bills. And so I did that for a few months after my internship, and then was able to kind of expand my role of jobs that I was looking or willing to take, and kind of through a variety of connections was able to take a short-term consultancy at the World Bank. So doing governance work for the World Bank. So when I say a short-term consultancy, it was for 20 days. I ended up being there for 2.5 years. So that tells you what short-term is. So while I was at the World Bank, I did a lot of work, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also some in South Asia, about citizen engagement, about how the World Bank, so the World Bank, for those of you who aren't familiar, makes loans directly to governments to do development projects. And so part of what I did was looking at how these projects engage citizens and how, to get feedback, to see how they consult them about the projects that they're doing. So it's not just this top-down approach to development, but also did country-level reviews of where there are areas in the projects that were open to corruption or where there are a lot of governance risks. So even though I wasn't really doing this kind of conflict resolution, peace building, human rights area that I had originally foreseen for myself, was doing a lot of work that had a lot of relevance to what I ultimately wanted to do, which, in terms of how systems kind of get into this cycle of bureaucratic inertia and they start perpetuating policies that are ultimately potentially damaging to the communities, how these larger organizations like the World Bank, how they operate, how difficult it is to operate within those systems, but also influence what's happening within those systems. And so it was a good experience, but ultimately decided that I wanted to make a more targeted move back to the peace building arena. So now I'm a policy research associate at Search for Common Ground, which is an international peace building organization. We work in 47 countries across the world doing local level peace building programming. So what that means is dispute resolution between different communities, whether it's based on ethnicity, religion, social status, gender, disabilities, all of those types of things. So providing platforms for them to come together in different situations to discuss the problems and find nonviolent solutions. It's tolerance building, it's conflict sensitivity and education, humanitarian aid, and that sort of thing. So that's the programming. My position is communicating the work that we do and the priorities from my colleagues on the ground to policy audiences to try and make their work easier by, trying to address the conflict that are happening across the world in a way that is constructive and addresses the root causes of the conflict and not just its consequences. So, yeah.
Thank you. Kelsey, your microphone is currently muted. Now you should be good. So what a day in your life.
All right. Well, thank you to the Career Center. Hello, Notre Dame. I'm the outlier in this group of ladies because I didn't attend Notre Dame as an undergrad, but as a grad student, and I actually just finished my master's. I guess it wasn't that recent. It was in May. And I just started a job last Monday. So let's see, going back in time, went to undergrad. So shout out to the social science, humanities folks in the room. Did, history, classics, poli-sci, whatever. Then I had no idea what I wanted to do because sometimes social sciences and humanities don't necessarily lead to clear-cut jobs, like an engineer or doctor or teacher, it's clear-cut. So I was like, why don't I go to Malaysia? So I got a Fulbright, and I highly recommended checking out the Fulbright program. If you are interested in international work, but you don't necessarily have a clear-cut vision of how you're going to get into it. I had a wonderful experience, and I know that Notre Dame has a really strong, Fulbright stream there or something. And so I taught at a Muslim school in a very rural area. And I came back to the States, in a post 9/11 environment where there, and obviously we see today that there is a very, very clear misunderstandings between the quote unquote Muslim world and the quote unquote Western world. And so I joined this really neat project that was out of Harvard's program of negotiation called the Abraham Path Initiative. So even though we're kind of part of Harvard, we were actually a separate NGO. And so my background is more of from an NGO nonprofit experience. And the Abraham Path is a long distance walking trail that goes through the Middle East. So the Fulbright's sort of a people-to-people diplomacy project. The Abraham Path was sort of a people-to-people diplomacy project mixed in with a socioeconomic development project because the path winds through very rural, marginalized communities that are now engaged in some socio-cultural economic development as part of the path. So I worked there for a few years, and I did a lot of communications work and fundraising, and sort of learned a lot of aspects of NGO organizations, and was plugged into a really wonderful network of folks, negotiators and peace builders from all over the world. And I decided I didn't really want to do fundraising and communications work. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about the content and the context. Before I started the Abraham Path, I didn't know anything about the Middle East. So shout out to folks in the audience that are maybe generalists and, want to bounce around. You don't have to be an expert in, a certain geographic area to end up, someday working in that geographic area. I think I took one Middle East course as an undergrad, and then worked in the Middle East, and have traveled there and, walked on the Turkey-Syria border and things like that. And so I decided, like a lot of people do once they reach this crux in their career where there's no, there wasn't any option for growth because I wasn't a peace expert, I decided to go to grad school, and that's where Notre Dame entered into my life, at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar if you're at this policy. Yeah. And so I had an amazing 2 years at Notre Dame, and the Kroc's graduate program is really unique in that 6 months of that 2 years was spent overseas doing policy research work in my case. So even though I was technically in grad school, I had a pretty practitioner focused program where they like to put us into practice situations more often than sort of scholarship situations and academic situations, which is really great. And I think very helpful for the workforce, considering, we're all young here, and it's not like we have 10 years of experience when we go out into the world to put on our resume, but we can say, I spent 6 months as a USAID Research and Innovation Fellow doing research for the African Union at a policy think tank in Cape Town, South Africa. And, while I was at grad school, or I consulted for 6 months with Mercy Corps, which is a big international NGO, but that was through a Notre Dame class that I took. And I went to a summer school on transitional justice I got Kroc to fund. So take advantage of, all these internships and fellowships and scholarships and researchships. Notre Dame's got money to give, I swear. And so afterwards, so I say that, take advantage, but you cannot just ride that wave of, wow, I have, my resume looks pretty sparkling. I have had all these, researchships or whatever. I graduated, and it took me nearly 8 months to get a job. So not to boohoo. I mean, I wasn't applying for jobs every day of those 8 months, I do have to say, but I think keeping in mind the expectations, again, these ladies have mentioned the competitiveness of DC. And one of the reasons why I might not have gotten a job as quickly is I didn't even look for jobs in DC. But I do think that in this realm and international work, DC is really where it's at. So anyways, to fast forward to February 6th, which was my first day at my new job, I ended up sort of leaving the international realm, and I'm now working for a New England-based policy organization that works with communities, the very grassroots level, doing community organizing work and policy advocacy work to clean up our air and our water. So my organization is called Toxics Action Center, and we do things like help close down coal power plants or stop pipelines from coming through our towns and cities, or clean up toxic waste sites and make sure the lead is out of our water, like that Flint doesn't happen in Westfield, Massachusetts, and things like that. So I was at the State House in Boston yesterday in a press conference, so I'm learning at a very different level what policy looks like from a very local US context, and it's really exciting and interesting. But all this to say, I did not have a clear linear path, for better or worse, whatever. But it's always, it's not always clear.
Thanks. Thank you all for those highlights. We're not going to have time to get to all of our moderated questions. Anya, do you want to go to number 3?
Well, I think, yes. What kind of an impact I'm taking your question, I'm sorry. Never mind. Kelsey, you gave us a little bit of an example of a daily project you were doing just then. Katie and Laura, could you very quickly give us kind of a glimpse of a project that you might do on a daily basis? And, just overview quick. Katie?
Sure. Well, I can just tell you about my day-to-day because it was a little bit a glimpse into a lot of the things I do. So this morning I started by developing with my team a 6-month advocacy and policy plan for Nigeria. So how are we going to, what are our objectives that we want to address in terms of specifically the farmer-herder conflict in the Middle Belt? So this is fairly specific on one conflict in Nigeria, and looking what our objectives are for how we want to influence that policy in the US side, and mapping out different activities for the next 6 months. Who are our targets? What kind of product are we trying to develop? Who all do we need to involve in that? What kind of research do we need? Then I went to the United States Institute of Peace, where I participated in a 3-hour working group meeting with members of USAID, the State Department, NGOs, humanitarian organizations, on the current state in Yemen, what's going on, what is the current context, and what are the opportunities to engage in the humanitarian and the non-humanitarian space. After that, I spent about 2 hours writing a paper, an op-ed on Nigeria, and then went to a NGO working group on the Central African Republic and the escalating crisis there that's been happening in the last 2 weeks, and there's no kind of support for it. So how can we engage in the US government right now when there's so much kind of fluidity in our leaders and our processes within all of these different institutions? So how can we as an NGO community that's staying fairly steady throughout this process, how can we be, a steady hand in bringing attention to that crisis?
Thanks, Laura.
All right. Today works. So let's see here. So part of my work today has been working on programming a survey into SurveyMonkey that will be given to recipients of grants of this foundation collaborative that I'm working with, that are all of these different foundations, many of which you'll recognize, are all getting together and trying to focus on secondary education in developing countries, because most of the money and most of the resources and interest for the past couple of years have all been on primary, and now sort of the next step is how do you improve outcomes in secondary education. So we're sending out a survey to these various grantees who are in primarily East Africa and India, to find out to sort of get a picture of what they're currently working on. Maybe some of asking them to estimate like how many youth they've served, how many teachers they've trained, how they're keeping track of their work. So, and the devil's in the details on a survey. If you get a chance, take a class on survey design, because they're tricky. Like even little things like how things are worded and formatted affects the quality of information you can get. So been working on that there's been a lot of back and forth. And then I had a meeting to brainstorm how we're going to do some measurements on these roads projects in Ghana and Tanzania. If you've been to any developing countries or even in parts of the US, like, when the road is terrible, but it's sometimes harder to tell like when the road is like having positive economic benefits on the livelihoods of those who are living up and down. And because unlike with education, the challenge is that like education, you can test the students who you taught, but with a road, like they could be anywhere. And so it's sort of a challenge of trying to estimate the benefits these roads are having to help inform how donors might provide roads to developing countries in the future. And then I'm also starting a proposal to do assessments of like preschool students in like a range of countries. Trying to figure out how we might go about that. I think it's like 7 countries, and it would start with sort of a mapping exercise to figure out what the lay of the land is, and then maybe try to come up with a way to measure early grade reading, early literacy and math skills. Yeah, that pretty much covers it.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. One of the things that we help students with all the time is translating their experiences, their skills into effective application documents, and then working with the transition to the world of work after graduation is how do you incorporate those skills into their career as they start out in their profession. So can you talk a little bit about how you translated or communicated some of the skills? Kelsey mentioned it a little bit, but in terms of both the application process and then what you found valuable as you started your careers.
Kelsey, why don't you begin?
Okay, just briefly, I'd say try to bring out, depends on the type of job that you're applying for, whether it's more of a desk job doing policy research, or if it's more of a communication, like advocating for that policy and being able to package that for different audiences. So I liked to highlight a lot of the project work I did in academic settings because, not only are you able to conduct the research, but you're able to communicate it, you're able to tailor it for different audiences, you're able to do group work, which you're probably going to have to engage with. So things like that have been helpful for me.
I can jump in. A few things that I found that were helpful for me is one, being able to show how you moved your academic learning into action. And so that could be, I learned about this topic in class, and so I decided to write my thesis on it. It could be, I was introduced to this organization, and so I did an internship with them and did XYZ. It can be a variety of different things, but being able, I wouldn't just say I took this class because that doesn't really mean anything. So just being able to show what you learned in that and how you took what you learned. And that doesn't have to be directly related to the theme of the place that you're going, but just being able to show that. And just like a couple of other quick things. I think that internships and opportunities, kind of like you said, the project work, internships, volunteer opportunities, any place where you can show that you're actually taking on responsibilities and gives you exposure to just people that are working in the area that you're interested in is really helpful. And specifically in resumes and cover letters, I would say moving beyond passion, you need to be able to show that you're actually interested in the topic, and you should show a level of passion and interest. But everybody who's applying to those jobs is just as passionate about those topics as you are. So don't spend your entire cover letter talking about how you are a bleeding heart for children dying in Africa. That may be true, and that's great, and I think that's important, but you also need to sell yourself for why it's important that you are the right fit for that job, that you have the skills for that job. And lastly, just really quick, have at least 2 professors that you have a relationship with because you're going to need letters of recommendation. I cannot tell you how many letters I've needed over the past 5 years. So I would say at least 2 professors, ideally 3 or 4 that you feel comfortable reaching back out to over the years, and even just say, can I reach out to you in 5 years when I decide I want to go to grad school? And how do you want me to approach you about that? Do you want me to send you my resume? Whatever it is. But I think that actually kind of making those connections now with the foresight that other job areas don't need as much. But in this field, you will need, like for the job I'm in now, I needed 3 people to write letters of recommendation for me for this job. So like, I would say that that's something to keep in mind.
I would definitely second everything that was just said. One thing that's sort of kind of related to this is, especially for those of you who are sort of in the early part of your academic career, I would sit and read job postings for like an hour, like things you think you might be interested. Look at the skills and the credentials of their thing, and so you can be like all the way along, even when it's not internship or job hunting time, knowing what the labor market is demanding, I know I sound like an economist right now, is so critical, because you can keep in mind to what you're doing and always be sort of doing that translation all the way through your career or all the way through your academic career is so valuable. Like that is one of the advice is like just sit and read job postings for an hour. So you know what's coming. Because I got to senior year and you learn it, but it's good to keep in the back of your head. Second, on top of everything that's been said about like talking about the concrete things you've done, also like being able to write and being able to think is going to be needed no matter where you go. Sort of writing, I had a great professor at Notre Dame, Professor Hoy in political science, who would not accept any more than 1,000-word essay that had to sort of capture everything we've learned up to that stage. And learning how to write for her is the best lesson I ever had, because I submitted an essay that was like 500 words over and I thought I could not get shorter. Well, she made me cut it back, and that's a lesson that sticks with me. I can cut stuff down to the stuff that matters, and that's like the kind of writing that matters most in when you're in the job, is write short to the point and really capture the most important information in a coherent way. And then just being able to think flexibly. I did a lot of language classes, and now I'm not as much involved in that. I've actually worked with data in Arabic, which is a total win. But also being able to think like stuff I've said this in an interview, like, yeah, I studied language and now I know how to translate economist into English. And it's fine, but it's true, because you have to be able to even take highly technical stuff and communicate that to a broad range of audiences. And that is it's the art of thinking that has been very valuable, and a line like that has actually worked in interviews before, because they understand that the ability to think and communicate clearly.
Thanks. I think at this point, I mean, we have plenty of moderated questions, but I don't feel like you all have to answer everyone. But I'd like to open it up to make sure that we get your questions answered as well.
Yeah, my name's CJ. And my question was jumping off of something Katie mentioned about having contacts with like real world bank stuff. And I was just curious, kind of how this whole having a contact leading to a job thing works, and if it's sending out emails to people that you know broadly, do you say, do you have any advice, or do you actually say, do you know the job, or what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I was in your shoes that if one more person told me that the key to getting a job in this area was networking, I was going to like lose it, because it was highly unhelpful, first of all, for someone to just say networking is helpful, but at the same time, it's like exactly what you need. So I will try and give you some advice that I think is a little bit more helpful than just saying networking. My connection to the World Bank was just a personal connection. You know, it was a friend of mine who knew that there was an opening there and passed along my resume. But in the broader scheme of things, I would say that there are strategic ways that you can really start to be involved. I mean, I think in DC and other places like this, you really need to be here. I think you can do that through a variety of ways. You can do an internship over the summer and start making connections. You can kind of move out here and kind of make your way a little bit. But I do think that you can change your address on your resume to a DC address of a friend. But I do think that that is an important criteria. But also I think in terms of how you network is really important. And I think that it's not just going to events and meeting people and just randomly saying things. It's going on LinkedIn and searching keywords of what you want to do, finding mutual connections and hunting people down. And it's, you know, reaching out to alumni. I mean, I've never met an ND alum who was not willing to talk to me. I would also say that the perspective that you have in terms of when you go to these meetings, like, should be, do I think that I am worth this person's time? And if the answer is yes, then you should email them regardless if you have a connection to them. I really truly believe that like, if you think that you could be an asset to them, then you should email them and say you want to learn more. Because I do think, like, in terms of what you do, there's so many resumes coming in for every single job, and they have to filter through somehow. And if you can just have emailed this person one time and you apply through their system, and you can shoot them an email and just say, hey, I'm so-and-so, we met so-and-so, we discussed so-and-so, I applied, I applied to this position. They might not do anything, but they also might just shoot an email to the person hiring and say, hey, take a look at that resume. So there are a variety of ways that you can go about doing it, but I really do think that being here is important, because you can go to the events, go and meet the people, go for coffees, but also don't be afraid of cold calling people, because most people are willing to meet if they've got the time.
Anybody else? Or
One is I've had sort of a different experience with networking. Is I think all of my jobs I've gotten the old-fashioned way of putting in an application and going through an interview process and getting an offer. And where interviewing or networking has really helped is I've gotten interview prep with someone who wasn't positioned high enough up to like recommend me, but who can talk me through like what they're looking for and things like that. Mm-hmm. People who can tell me sort of what their process is like, what different organizations are really looking for, not just what's on their mission statement. And I don't know, sometimes I've been in experiences where I've like been around students who are networking and they like sort of like see that I can't get them a job and sort of they wander off. When there's also like life lessons about like the landscape and different organizations, and sort of more of a fact-finding type of networking is what I've found to be most effective. And so I don't know, I would advise you to like keep listening. Even the young alums who have been there and been through the same process can have a lot of valuable information, even if they're not in a position to just pass your resume along.
Another question?
Yeah, my question is for Laura. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to pursue an MPP over some other graduate options, because that's one of the trajectories I'm kind of thinking about. And then also how it's helped you in your years since graduation from the Harris School and the job.
Oh, absolutely. The MPP, as it turns out, has been just about exactly what I was looking for. Because like I was explaining earlier, like I sort of was in this position where I was helping disseminate other people's research, but I wanted to be able to get my hands dirty, so to speak, with understanding, to do the research myself. And the MPP is sort of the best way I've found to describe it to people who don't understand is it's kind of like an MBA for the public and the nonprofit sector, where it's very much an applied degree where you're expected to sort of learn stuff in class, and classes were challenging, but they were all like very much like skills-based classes where then you're expected to be applying it to your area of interest. And so I was with a lot of people who were all in the same place, but were interested in public finance and education, domestic, international stuff. But they were all specifically sort of seeking that skill building approach. And so I got in, I knew exactly what I wanted to do is along the lines of what I'm doing now. And so I was able to sort of take the core classes, the economics and the statistics, but then to also sort of tailor the rest of my classes and my projects to my interests. And so it's sort of an MPP is kind of what you make of it. But I think it's been a really good experience because I've gotten the quantitative skills that are increasingly in demand, but also just sort of an understanding of how to think. So it was a lot of economics, a lot of statistics, But unlike in the economics program proper, it's very much applied. Like, it's not as esoteric. It's very much like, this is a real world problem and this is how we would use these tools to solve it, which is, I think, a very good approach. I think it is very valuable to have some work experience going in, so you can do that tailoring. But yes, sort of the MPP is, that's what I wanted and that's what I got. And yeah.
Thank you.
Another question? Go ahead.
It's a similar question. It was for Laura and Katie about policy research, and that was, what kind of experience with quantitative research do you have in undergrad, and what would you recommend for someone who doesn't have that experience, like transitioning into policy research?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand quite all of the details of that question. It was a little muffled.
Oh, if you don't have, like, what kind of classes in quantitative research do you take in undergrad, if you did take any, and what would you recommend for someone who hasn't taken that if they want to transition into policy research?
Let's see here. I took basic macro and micro. In hindsight, I wish I'd taken more. More micro especially would have been valuable. I also took, I took one quantitative research class. Professor Coppedge taught a poli-sci research methods class. That was actually a pretty good introduction to those things, and we actually used statistical software. And then actually I was an international scholar with the Kellogg Institute, and I got to apply some of that. I was working with Professor Dowd, who was just a professor at the time. He wasn't the head of anything yet. And so because I had that class, I could then work with some of his data. But in general, most of my experiences happened afterwards. Yeah, between working with Excel for some of my jobs and other things, but then most of my training has been either in graduate school or on the job. But whatever you can take, I recommend, because it's quantitative research. It's not just being able to do it yourself. It's also being able to understand if other people's stuff is worth listening to, because there's a lot of fuzzy math going on, especially in DC.
Yeah. Yeah, I only took micro as an undergrad. I would definitely, if you're a poli-sci major, I would take the quantitative resources class you were referencing, because as I didn't know, you can't graduate with honors if you don't take it. No one told me that in poli-sci, so just a little bit of tidbit that you can pass along to you guys. But yeah, so I just took micro. I would recommend taking micro and macro, just because almost any graduate program that you would apply to is going to require both of those. So you'll have to take it at some point. But yeah, I mean, I think that I did have to learn how to use Stata and stuff when I did my thesis. And so I, grabbed my Mendoza buddies and asked them to teach it to me. But I would just say that it depends on which kind of policy research you want to do, because the research that I am doing, for example, is based primarily on the work that we're already doing in our organization. So we have an entire design monitoring and evaluation team that does the actual impact analysis themselves. And then I take that information, do the qualitative and the desk research that evolved around it, and, go and doing field interviews, things like that supplement that actual hard data to develop these larger products that are policy relevant. So there are opportunities. Some of the more kind of bigger organizations like the, Brookings or Rand Corporation, or some of those more kind of wonky type think tank areas are going to want you to have an SPSS or a Stata skill set, but I mean, it's not the only option, and there are plenty of free courses you can take too on I don't know if Coursera does one, but I know that there are options out there on the internet as well.
I'm going to extend that question to Kelsey too. And have you seen quantitative methodology to be valuable or important in the more person-to-person diplomacy work that you've done and the grassroots work that you've done?
Less so, although monitoring and evaluation is a hot commodity right now. And I'm not sure, Eric, you might know if ND's IGD, Minister for Global Development, they do a ton of research analytics, and they came into a program in design and evaluation organization course I took. And I know that they provide internal training, and I'm wondering if they do a little like seminar for students. I don't know. But that's something worth looking into. That's ND's IGD. And at Mendoza, I learned a little bit more about doing field research and focus group discussions and interviews. And then at Kroc, they do a lot more, what is it called? Catherine Bolton does more like oral history stuff. And that is that type of qualitative data research is really valuable. And I know Search for Common Ground uses a lot of qualitative research for peace building programming and at the State Department as well. So I worked on a project for the US Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor, and we were evaluating sort of in a qualitative way how Syrian-led organizations were providing services for Syrians. And in response to that assessment, which was purely qualitative, you know, that US State Department entity granted, you know, millions of dollars of funds to these Syrian-led organizations. So don't rule out qualitative methods. There's definitely resources within Notre Dame, both the institutes at Notre Dame and also professors that teach full-blown courses on qualitative.
Just one more resource. Search does a DM&E for Peace platform, which has like each Thursday they do about an hour segment where they bring in different impact evaluators and different leading thoughts on that area. So if it's something that you're interested in quantitative and how that's moving into kind of this more social sciences, harder to capture indicators and things like that, that's something you're interested in, it's open for everybody to engage in.
And connecting Kelsey's point about on-campus centers and institutes with an earlier point about networking being more than just getting a job. There are a lot of resources on campus where you can do informational interviews to learn more about the kinds of work that's going on out in the world. So that you use those while you're here, even if you don't have a direct connection to them right now. Other questions?
I have two questions actually for Kelsey. The first is just, I'm wondering, with all the international experience you had, how did you really capitalize on that in interviews? What did you really try to highlight from that experience to really help you stand out? And then the second question is kind of specific, but I was just wondering if you could talk about that transitional justice summer school that you went to, because that sounds really, really interesting.
Cool. Well, I think in terms of international experience, people appreciate cross-cultural competency. And that is something that you can translate to a domestic space, but also that you appreciate local solutions to local problems because you've been in those local situations. I think always when translating into a job interview, to have an anecdote that might, shine a light on how that international experience in particular positioned you for that job or might make you stronger in that job. Or maybe, I was asked the question about passion in an interview. And so to have those anecdotes at your fingertips. Also, if you do have this international experience, you can talk about flexibility, adaptation, and things like that. And then obviously, if you are going into working within a region where you have experience, that'll get you far. I think languages are huge as well. So I was able to capitalize on that a little bit, but Laura's definitely, got it with the Arabic. I really wish that I could rewind and become an undergrad again and take some Arabic courses. Would have been really valuable. But and then this Transitional Justice Summer School. So it's the Transitional Justice Institute is based at a university in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And it's actually really cool, and it brings together people in their careers. So they're not academics, they're not students, they're people who work for USAID or who work for a Swedish development agency, who work for the International Criminal Court at The Hague or in the Congo. And each summer they have a topic that's a subtopic of transitional justice. Mine was focused on gender and reparations. So as countries, come out of conflict, what mechanisms are in place when it comes to transitional justice, and within that, what are geared towards perhaps gender-based violence and women victims of the conflict and things like that. And the reason why I participated in that summer school is because I was going to a policy think tank in South Africa, which did a ton of work on transitional justice. And I was like, I'm new to the TJ field. And it was sort of my primer, my crash course, week long, really intensive, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. for a week. And we had these really amazing speakers, like people that led, tribunals at the International Criminal Court and things like that. Were part of this program. And so Notre Dame has sent folks to it. One of my classmates did it, and I did it the following year. So yeah, and there's lots of summer institutes, in every subtopic you can think of.
Nice. Thank you. So we are getting close to time. So in 90 seconds or less, if you could convey your biggest piece of advice or recommendation to people exploring careers in public policy, how can they be successful? Anyone?
Yeah, I can say, I think that something that I've seen just in my own perspective, from my own experience, but also from what I've heard from my fellow panelists here, is that don't be afraid to take, any kind of position, because one of the most frustrating, but also the most liberating things about this field is that you can take any route to get to a position and still get there. So while it's really frustrating at a lot of times, because it's not kind of like, if I take this class, if I do this internship and I go to this career fest, I'm going to get a job, because it's not like that. And so that's really frustrating. But at the same time, it's really liberating in a lot of ways, because you're not really you don't have to, there's not as much pressure about taking the jobs, because all of them have valuable information that can help you in your next step. So if you're looking for specific things to get out to the DC area, Hill experience is never a bad thing. You can always, if it's not, I knew, I was like, I don't want to work in government. I don't want to do it. I don't want to work on the Hill. And now every day I'm like, I wish I had at least done an internship on the Hill, and so I think that there are opportunities to really just get your feet wet, and you learn a lot about what you want to do by learning what you don't want to do. And so, so I think, don't get frustrated, but also it is a difficult path. You have to have a lot of perseverance and a lot of, drive to do this thing. So I would just make sure that you're aware of that and try and be as best prepared as you can be.
So sort of, since I work with data, sort of my take on it is collect some data. Don't just wait until you're looking at graduation in a month. Really read job postings, read career guides, read a lot that sort of can help, that identify sort of what's in demand, what are people looking for, and then also inventory yourself and inventory what's out there, and really sort of use that information to help you chart your path in undergrad, and then align and do that translation of your experience to the job market, because it's not always easy and it takes a lot of trial and error. I wrote a lot of terrible cover letters. But by just sort of knowing what's out there, not in a, I will apply for this job or no, is, I think, incredibly valuable because you don't know until you start looking, and it's better if you start looking early.
Kelsey, as someone who just went through the application and interview, any fresh tips?
Well, use the resources there. Eric was amazing. I found him too late because by the time he did a practice interview with me, I had already done all my terrible interviews. So definitely do some practice interviewing because I thought, oh, like I'm okay at talking. It doesn't mean that you translate well to a good interviewer. So definitely do some practice interviewers. It sounded silly and like I didn't need it, but you do. To second what the lady said, start looking early. I should have maybe sprinkle out a few applications in your spring semester before you graduate. Definitely something I would have liked to have, just even if it's to throw out the practice ones before you really mean it. And then, LinkedIn is a great resource. It sounds silly, but I stalk people on LinkedIn every day. And if you find some people that are in positions that look kind of sexy or like something that you want to do, look back and see what their trajectory looked like. You can always have an informational interview with them, of course, but even if you have that public information about some of the things, maybe they did a weird course or an internship. So definitely use career services, LinkedIn, and start as early as possible.
Nice. Well, I have two bits of housekeeping. One, if you came in late and didn't sign in before you go, please do sign in over there. And if you had questions that you didn't have a chance to answer, on your handouts, you do have contact information for these wonderful panelists. They've all generously offered to allow you to follow up with them if you need to. So please join me in thanking our panelists for all this. Thank you all. So great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks.